I'm Drew Stevenson, and this is a video from my Law and Economics seminar about the economics of constitutional design. And in this video, we're going to be talking about the separation of powers and federalism. Now, I made an introductory video for this unit that's kind of an overview of different areas of interdisciplinary studies for the law and economics of common law or constitutional law. And some of those deal with specific provisions of the Constitution or specific types of interpretation of the Constitution, or the sort of abstract idea of having a Constitution at all. And others deal with the sort of structural features, kind of sort of big picture structure of the Constitution. So I had one video that about the supermajority requirement for changing a constitution. And here we're going to be talking about separation of powers and federalism, the sort of checks and balances that the Constitution creates in our legal system to avoid the concentration of power. So let's take a look at my slides and see where we go with this. And I'm going to be drawing on heavily in these videos on Richard Posner's the chapter in his treatise on economic analysis of law about constitutional law, but he is in turn is kind of giving a quick overview or allusion, a reference to a lot of different authors in this field. So first, let's talk about, in terms of the economics of constitutional design, that there's a tension between efficiency and a democracy. And so the more efficient you make the government, the easier it is for the government to act quickly and decisively, the less democratic it would be. We go through periods of our history, including I'm recording this in 2023, the current era, where authoritarianism becomes a more popular idea for a lot of people. A lot of people want a unitary executive who has a strong domineering personality. They want a president who will boss people around and get things done, and so forth. And so the fact is, dictatorships can be very efficient, right? Or there's the old saying that when Mayor Daley was running Chicago, that he made the buses run on time, or that Stalin could keep the trains running on time in the Soviet Union. And so authoritarian governments can enforce rules and get things done, but that there's a big trade-off with that, right? That they are less democratic, and so they're less accountable to the people and the will of the people. The people are not governing themselves. If you want the people to govern themselves, it's going to be messy and inefficient and much harder to get things done. And so that's kind of just the inherent trade-off with a democracy. Is if you like democracy and you want everybody to have a voice, that also means that an awful lot of the time you're not going to get your way or get what you want. So constitutions confine governments to measures that basically prevent negative externalities and encourage positive externalities. In other words, that the Constitution limits the government and what it can do, and sort of leaves it so that there's a narrow range of sort of beneficial laws that often involve dealing with negative externalities and fostering positive externalities, or cost maximizing policies, right? That if the government wants to do something, it's going to be difficult and expensive if you have a constitution. Now, here's an argument about Supreme Court interpretation. The more broadly the Supreme Court interprets the constitutional provisions that limit the powers of the elected branches, the more it moves the nation towards limited government. So if you are a libertarian, you don't trust the government, you want as little government as possible. You've probably heard the old saying that's attributed to Thomas Jefferson. I don't know if it's accurate or not, that the government that governs best is the one that governs the least. And so if you want a very limited government because you think that that gives people more freedom or the market more room to expand, then you might want limited government. And one of the ways that we get a more limited government is if the courts give a robust or broad interpretation to any provisions in the Constitution related to checks and balances. Or in other words, if they say, look, the executive branch can only do what's delineated clearly in the Constitution. Congress can only do what's spelled out in Article 1 of the Constitution, and so forth. And so if you move, and then the argument is that if you constrain each of the branches of government, the more you do that, the more the government overall is limited in size and power. And one advantage of that, the argument goes, is it shifts it away from denigration or exploitation of politically powerless groups by a Democratic majority. And so here, though, I want to say something that there's sort of some rival schools of thought that you should be aware of. So one idea is that that the Constitution is in itself inherently anti-democratic, and the concern is that when you have one of the downsides of a democracy is the majority, whoever the majority is, will have control of the legislature, and they'll pass laws that hurt minority groups, right? Whether a minority religion or political dissidents or a different race or immigrants, or people that live in a remote region of the country, and maybe they're speak a different language or have a different dialect or something like that. And so if you're worried about that democracies allow the majority to kind of be tyrannical and oppressive of minorities, then then you might view the Constitution as designed to kind of allow the majority to generally have self-governance, but to have some limitations on that. The flip side of that, of course, is if you think that most of the oppression and exploitation and mistreatment of minorities in our society actually is extra legal or happens outside of the legal system, and that we actually need laws to protect those groups, not just the Constitution, but we need statutes and regulations to protect basically exploited and persecuted minorities from the sort of mistreatment and discrimination and prejudice that they face in social interactions and in the workplace and so forth. And so in that sense, there are people who are very concerned about protecting the rights of minorities. And this could be religious minorities, unpopular religious groups, or political dissidents, or racial minorities, or people based on national origin or sexual orientation who actually want big government or want a stronger government because they think the government will protect them from what's going on outside of the legal system in sort of day-to-day interactions. There's no right answer to this, but you should understand that part of the sort of alignment of our parties and disagreement between the parties in our society right now is whether there's an assumption that that most of the mistreatment of vulnerable groups in our society is happening through the legal system, and therefore, and as a result of democracy, or is happening in spite of our legal system, and therefore the legal system needs to be stronger, and the government needs to be stronger in order to protect the vulnerable groups. Okay, so let's go back. As I've said, constitutions inherently foster limited government rather than democratic government. And this varies, of course, from country to country. And you should be aware that limited government is in the eye of the beholder, right? So there's lots of people who say they want limited government, but they also want to have censorship of what's shown on television or what's taught in the school. They want to have a lot of controls over what their children are taught in schools and things like that. So again, a lot of times people say they want limited government when they're criticizing laws that they don't like. They want to be left alone, but they are happy to interfere to have very strong government for things that they want, like, let's say, getting tough on crime or having border enforcement or things like that. I do want to point out for my students that there's a legal philosopher named Hans Kelsen was very, very influential in Western Europe, Central and Western Europe in the 20th century. and is less well known in the United States. But he was a legal positivist and who wrote a lot about constitutions and constitutional law and had a hand in shaping some of the constitutions in Western Europe. And one of sort of the common themes in Hans Kelson's writings are that all rights are simultaneously a restraint, right? So if you have a right, basically, if that right means anything, what it means is we're restraining other people from, like the government agents, from doing something to you, from infringing on whatever that right is. And so this is not the way we often talk about rights in our public discourse. We honestly talk about rights in our modern society almost like they're a spiritual thing or a substance, almost in theological terms. But Hans Kelsen was a legal realist or positivist who basically said every right could be just described as a restraint, and every restraint on government, any restriction or limitation we put on government, is essentially a right for the people to challenge a government action. And it's just basically two different ways of expressing the same thing. Okay, let's keep going with the economics of constitutional design. In Richard Posner's book, he poses the question, sort of to start class discussions maybe, of why would the majority in a democracy ever decide to expand the franchise? In other words, to let more people vote. And so we've done this at various times in our society in the United States. So we let people who the first step was to let people who didn't own property vote. And then to, as you probably know, in the early 20th century, to let women vote, then to let minorities vote, racial minorities or former slaves vote. And there's still an issue with this. There's a movement in our society to restore voting rights for felons after they've served their jail sentence and are back out in society and working again and things like that. Or a question about legal residents from other countries and immigrants and whether they should be able to, for example, vote in local elections or things like that. And some people get very upset about this idea because they have an idea that only citizens should vote. But the fact is, our society has changed the rules really drastically over time to expand how many people can vote. And so in theory, we could continue to do that. But the question is, why would people ever want to let more people, the people who have the power to do this, give the power to more? And one theory or answer is that the party in power who orchestrates the expansion thinks that those prospective someday voters are more likely to support their party. And so I'm recording this video in 2023. This is definitely a talking point in our public debates about immigration, where people who are against immigrants and opposed to immigration will accuse those who support immigrants' rights of basically wanting their votes, thinking that if we bring more people here, that they'll all vote for a certain political party and so forth. I don't think that that's true, but I hear that argument all the time from conservative pundits. And I will also tell you the story, for example, a pretty well documented historical story about women getting the vote is related to prohibition, right? So there were certain people that were very, very devoted to the cause of getting a constitutional amendment to ban alcohol for prohibition in the early 20th century. And prohibition was actually much more popular with women than it was with men in this country. And at the time, women couldn't vote. And so the advocates for prohibition, or the Prohibition Party, basically, threw its support behind the suffrage movement and realized that they needed to have women be able to vote in order to get this particular part of their political agenda of the prohibition of alcohol passed as a constitutional amendment. And so you had people who were in power, but who were in the legislatures or held office, but who held an idea that they weren't sure they could get a supermajority for. And so they decided that the way to do that was to expand the franchise and support voting rights for women. And sure enough, soon after women got the vote, prohibition was passed. Now, prohibition was repealed a few years later, but that's an interesting historical example of a group that realized that they had a popular idea, an idea that was pretty popular, but not super majority popular, to get a constitutional amendment. And they were explicit about the fact that they wanted to expand the franchise and have women vote so that they could get prohibition added as an amendment to the Constitution. Okay, let's talk about disenfranchisement and the idea of universal suffrage. So what if we just let everybody vote? And so everybody who is a resident, every adult, let's say, and there was nobody who's like not allowed to vote. And so the disenfranchisement of any group invites efforts to redistribute wealth from them to other groups with electoral power. And in other parts of the law and economics course, we talk about why basically coerced transfers are inefficient, right? And so if you think about it, if you see a certain group that owns a lot of stuff that you want, you wish you could just take their land, or you think that they have a lot of savings or something like that, and you would like to just transfer that, redistribute that to yourself and take that away, that you can do that by basically undermining that group's ability to vote. Then you can control the legislature and basically use the legal system to transfer their property or assets or wealth to others. And this has, again, happened throughout history. Another argument for having universal suffrage, just letting as many people as possible vote, is that elections actually do yield valuable information about citizens' preferences. When Posner wrote a book, he said maybe this is less important as scientific polling improves, although in the last few election cycles, the pollsters have sort of been embarrassed with their inaccurate predictions about the outcome. And so the fact is that polling is still kind of an imprecise science compared to what election returns are going to be like. So the more people vote, the more the government actually knows what the people want. And that can be really valuable information to know about citizens' preferences and citizens' changing preferences, right? So there are certain ideas that are very popular today that were not as popular a few years ago. Also, keep in mind that the larger the electorate, the more difficult it is to form coalitions to form redistributive ends. And so this was part of has been an argument in on different continents, actually, at different times in history, where you have a lot of little countries that are always at war with each other. And then each of those countries in turn is very unstable internally. And if you combine those into a very large country like the United States, it makes it much harder for one special interest group to basically hijack the process, right? So any group it dilutes the power of each of the special interest groups. And so one of the arguments for the success of the United States in the early days was that we didn't have the northern industrialized states. They weren't able to dominate the southern agricultural states, and vice versa. And as we added more states, it made it harder and harder for one region of the country to basically dominate all of the others. You could also see, let's talk again about, instead of voting, just the separation of powers between the branches of government. And you could view this as preventing a monopoly in politics. And so in law and economics, we study the inefficiency of having market monopolies. So when you have only one company, I want you to imagine a scenario where there's only one company in the country that makes vaccines or that sells books, like Amazon. We have come close. When I started teaching, there were basically two companies that published almost all of the law school textbooks, case books that we use for classes. And so the monopolies create a lot of problems, right? And the market inefficiencies, overpricing, and lower quality of goods, and so forth. And the separation of powers kind of prevents monopolies of government power. It also prevents catastrophic systemic risks that arise in centralized systems. And so if you think about a national crisis like a pandemic or a big natural disaster or something like that, even though concentrating all the power in one, let's say, authoritarian leader, or a leader that is very, very popular and that people would sort of follow to the ends of the earth, let's say, that the problem is that people are fallible, and when you centralize power, a mistake that person makes, either because they're just wrong or they had imperfect information, or something goes wrong in the process, that has huge systemic effects. And basically, when you have separation of powers, you decentralize and deconcentrate some of the power, and that helps lower the risk of systemic risks to society overall. So if our entire pandemic response, or all of our public health policy, is dependent on just one person, then that person making a mistake can have catastrophic risks, right? Can basically be the demise of society. And the same is true if you have one person who has basically concentrated authority over all of the armed forces or something like that. We do have a commander in chief in this country, but the power is heavily delegated through the sort of chain of command in the military, and a lot of generals and different branches of government and so forth. But anytime you concentrate power and centralize a system, you create a systemic risks that can be catastrophic instead of hurting only part of the system. Let's talk about government agencies for a moment. A traditional argument against having regulatory agencies is that they undermine the separation of powers by concentrating all of the functions of the different branches in one department. In other words, you'll have an agency like the National Labor Relations Board that adjudicates and promulgates. So they do adjudicatory functions, they do legislative functions when they promulgate rules, and they bring enforcement actions and issue like cease and desist letters and so forth, that are oversee union votes and elections that are essentially executive branch. And so the argument has been that judicial review is particularly important as a check on agencies for this reason. At the same time, each agency is too small to really threaten democracy or liberty on a major scale, right? So you'll hear people that are, political hotheads talking about how the agency that they hate most, or they resent the most, whether it's the CDC or the FDA or the Securities and Exchange Commission or the ATF. There's a lot of people who are pundits who have one agency that they think is the biggest problem in the world. But the fact is, most agencies have limited staff and limited power and limited scope of their authority, and so, or reach. So each agency is really too small to hurt the whole country or to threaten democracy overall. And so what administrative law does is it concentrates the functions of the three branches of government, and basically brings them in-house, but also simultaneously fragments that combined power into lots of little pieces. So maybe the concentration, the mixing of adjudicatory, legislative, and executive functions in a regulatory agency don't pose a threat, because each agency is so limited in its scope and staffing, and power and capacity. Independent agencies are arguably enhance the separation of powers because they can tend to function almost as a fourth branch of government. So these are a lot of our boards and bureaus and commissions, whereas executive branch agencies that have a single leader like a secretary or administrator running them, sort of blur the line between the separation of powers and present a different type of systemic risk to the constitutional scheme. As I've mentioned before, separation of powers raises transaction costs significantly. And so any type of checks and balances, so we have different types of checks and balances in our government. So we have the separation of powers between the legislative branch, executive branch, and judicial branch. We then have broken the legislative Congress into two houses. And then we also have a fragmenting of power or checks and balances between the federal government and the state governments. All of these sort of separations of powers and checks and balances significantly raise the transaction costs of governance. So it makes the government much less efficient at everything, and slows it way down, right? So everything is going to take longer and take a lot more effort and investment to get anything done. Again, when we're talking about election years and candidates and campaigns, you would get the idea that people really want bold change, right? And big promises and drastic reforms and things like that is very popular with voters, especially the voters that are outspoken politically. But the fact is, the founding fathers set up the country to have political gridlock intentionally, to make it really hard to do anything and to change anything except to have incremental change. And so inherent in our constitutional system then is the idea that the founding fathers thought that the best system allows for slow incremental change that's very costly, whether it's in terms of passing laws and especially in terms of changing the Constitution, but that can be frustrating if you are somebody who wants a dramatic change, right? Change we can believe in or things like that. This is not change you can believe in. This is the Constitution, and we have checks and balances and very high transaction costs. So it's hard to get anything done. On the other hand, if you mistrust the government and you think the government messes up more than it helps, then maybe it's a good thing to have the government be painfully slow and inefficient. Because when the government is able to act quickly and decisively and concentrate its power and efforts, if it makes a mistake, that mistake is really going to hurt. So you should think about that maybe we want a government. There are benefits, or at least an argument, to having a government that's inefficient, government employees that are inefficient, and having the government be very slow at bringing change, because it also means we're going to be slow. There's plenty of time to correct course if you're making mistakes. An upside of the separation of powers is specialization of the government workforce. And economists, since the time of Adam Smith, have talked about how specialization actually makes things much more efficient, right? So people who can focus on just one task. If you specialize in an area of law, you're going to get really good at that, right? And your learning curve for each new client kind of starts to go away, because if you're practicing in a very specific area, every type of case that comes, you're familiar with the body of law already. You know what you're doing. You even know the other people, lawyers in your legal community who work in that area. You have an idea of how long things take and so forth. So you become much more, if you specialize, you become much more efficient. And the same is true with specialization in medicine and specialization in engineering and so forth. The more you specialize, there's a lot of benefits of you becoming more efficient and productive. And there are downsides to specialization, right? So a lot of people would like to be a generalist so that they can adapt to changing circumstances. But the separation of powers does foster specialization. And so for example, people who have been in Congress for many terms really get used to how Congress works. And so we can talk about term limits, but there's an advantage sometimes of having somebody who's seasoned and knows how to set realistic expectations, and if we really do want to get something done, how that has to happen. and so forth. So, and that's a type of specialized knowledge. This can also be an advantage of having someone who, let's say, was a governor run for president, because they have some of this specialized experience in the executive branch. And that concludes this video about the separation of powers and federalism and some of the structural features of our constitutional framework.